The Civil War. The Civil War was a violent event that lasted for 4 years, beginning around 1861 and ending in 1865. Starting in South Carolina, eventually spreading throughout our country, the battle between the Confederates and the Nationalists caused havoc and casualties in millions.
Resulted in Union victory, which meant that slavery was abolished and the Reconstruction era began. But what is most important about the war is its women.
Women had limited rights during the time of the Civil War, but they still played a crucial role. Many were spies, nurses, rights advocates, cooks, war hawks, slaves, etc. They were important because they played a very active role in several movements while catering to the needs of the men who were fighting in the war.
Nurse. Spy.
Over 400 women fought in the war disguised as men on both sides. They also baked and canned foods for the men and sewed uniforms and other clothing. They knitted socks, gloves, and blankets to keep the soldiers warm, and they fundraised campaigns, fairs, and other events to raise money for medical supplies. They wanted to work on the front lines so they could care for the sick and injured soldiers right away, and they traveled from hospital to hospital to make sure they were okay. A difference between the women on both sides of the war was that Southern women relied on their slaves to do housework versus the Northern women who continued to work inside the house as well as on the field.
Harriet Beecher Stowe was an American abolitionist. Born in Litchfield, Connecticut, she was the seventh child born to a famously religious family. After a lot of moving around when she was younger, her family was settled in Maine by 1850. There, in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, she retaliated against slavery in her own way by writing her most celebrated work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She is perhaps one of the most influential female figures during this time because her success had legitimized an established role in public affairs. Evidently, the Northerners weren't completely satisfied because Tom's Cabin endorsed not abolition but colonization rather. Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave that had been born into slavery in Maryland. She was able to escape slavery because her owner had died. After that, she had traveled to Pennsylvania because it was a free state. In Tubman's words, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." In 1849, she escaped to freedom, and then she became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an elaborate network of safe houses, and how it worked was freed blacks would send someone in disguise to discuss their escape plan. Then a conductor guided the fugitive to the first station. Eventually, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, a law that stated slaves who had escaped could be captured from the North and returned back to slavery, including freed slaves. Harriet Tubman was risking her life to save families and other slaves from plantations in the South.
Clara Barton was a very influential woman during the time of the Civil War. She was known for her knowledge of the humanities and sense of peace from a very young age. At the age of 10, she took care of her brother who was sick, and also at the age of 17, she received a certificate for teaching. She wanted to serve her country and therefore decided to participate in the war. She was a teacher, patent clerk, and nurse in the war, and she also remained doing humanitarian work in the house unlike many other women in the war. At the start of the war, the Baltimore riot took place, which led to the first bloodshed in the war. Victims in Massachusetts were shipped to D.C., where Barton was living at the time. She acted as a nurse for over 40 men who had arrived there. She provided crucial personal assistance to the men in uniform, and she also took supplies to the Capitol building to help heal the wounded men. After the war, she wanted to respond to letters written by men during the war who were labeled as missing. This soon began, quote, the search for the missing men. Clara Barton is most famously known for finding the American Red Cross. It's a humanitarian organization that provides emergency assistance, disaster relief, and education in the United States. It takes pride in helping others no matter their location, race, or religion, and also provides basic necessities to people when they have nowhere else to go. Little did Clara Barton know the impact she would have on society for many years to come. Rose O'Neal Greenhow was a spy for the Confederacy. She and her sister began as orphans, however, they ended up living with their aunt in a boarding house located at the old Capitol building. Here, Greenhow made many connections with senators, presidents, and generals, such as John C. Calhoun and James Buchanan. As she got older, she decided she wanted to preserve slavery and other Southern ways of life. She decided to use her friendships with these people of higher authority as a way to gain key military information. She would pass this information along to Confederates during the war. In fact, she helped ensure the South's victory in the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. She told Confederate Army Captain Thomas Jordan information regarding Union military movements. This helped Jordan and the rest of his army to defeat the North. After being suspected to be a spy, she was eventually put on house arrest. While imprisoned, she continued to pass messages and once waved the Confederate flag out of her window. Her devotion to the South was clearly shown, considering her thriving spirit continued after being locked behind closed doors. Frances Clayton was enlisted in the Union Army. She fought in 18 battles in the Civil War disguised as a man named Jack Williams. She served both cavalry and artillery units for the Nationalists, and she was described as a very tall, masculine-looking woman bronzed by exposure. She also had a masculine stride in walking and was very proud of her work. Clayton frequently took part in male soldierly activities such as drinking, smoking, or chewing tobacco so she would fit in with the other men. The cause of her death is uncertain. Historians believe that she was either shot in the hip during one of her 18 battles or was discharged after her husband's death during one of them. Frances Clayton inspired thoughts and future movements provoking women's equality, since her job during the Civil War was one typically done by men. The legacy of women in the Civil War began before the war was even started during the abolitionist movement. There was a birth of feminism begun by Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who wrote speeches about abolition in the 1830s. They, among many other white women, saw similarities between themselves and enslaved black men and women and decided to make a difference.
The idea of true womanhood was changed. After playing such a crucial role in the war, women discovered their true capabilities and began searching for equality to men. The war had given women new chances that they hadn't had before, like earning their own money, controlling their own lives, managing their own finances, and being overall more independent.
After the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement began, and it was started by Susan B. Anthony. It fought for political rights for women, and eventually the National Women's Suffrage Association was formed. Anthony's ideas were combined with Elizabeth Stanton's to secure the 15th Amendment, which stated the right to vote should not be denied by race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Finally, the amendment was ratified in 1870.
I'm sorry, wait. Good boy. Women had... Sorry, I'm just gonna don't pause up.
Yeah, no, keep going.
Okay. Women had limited... advocates, cooks. You could not have picked a worse time to jump... Let me fix my pop socket first.
Okay.
Okay, go.